Well, welcome everybody to our Score Plus Teach number 3. We are excited that you're here with us. Today's session is going to be on the lovely session that Dr. Tanya Christ provided for us a few weeks ago on Not Just a Book on the Carpet, Read Alouds as Core K2 Comprehension Instruction. So we are pleased to have you here. And I want to introduce some of the folks that have helped us get this far. So we have Dr. Miranda Fitzgerald. She's here today. Hope was helping us with some of these other things. And she's not on, but I'm excited to share, and she will see this in the recording, that Jennifer Mary is, as of today, Dr. Jennifer Mary. So we are really excited for Jennifer. And we are also excited for Shannon. Okay, so some welcome and tidbits. As you know, all the participants are muted. It just helps with the audio and the visuals to go smoothly. You can use the chat if you want to, if you have any questions. We'll have some time for questions at the end that we can look at. And then we are going to put a link to the guided notes in the chat. So once we get going, we'll have a spot for that so we don't lose it within everyone's conversations right now. This is being recorded, and we will be sending the videos through email. And Miranda is our AI bot eliminator, so she will be sending out the bots as they come in. We want to keep our participants people focused. Okay, so quick rundown for the next 90 minutes. Are you ready? We are going to start with our welcome and introductions. We want to know a little bit about all of you. We are going to be debunking a couple myths, talking about 4 K2 read aloud practices. We're going to then connect it to the curriculum and follow up with some leadership and coaching support ideas, and then give you a chance to actually think about planning and what all of this means and your own practices. So it's going to be a really fast and furious 90 minutes, but hopefully this will be great content that you're able to implement in your classrooms. All right, so who's here? We've got where you're from, and I'm going to share the poll for you to tell us a little bit about yourself. So you can share where you're located again, but also share your role. And what's the last question? What grade levels you serve? Yes, so we want to know a little bit about who your role is, the grade levels that you're teaching, and I'm going to let you know that my name is Dr. Angela Preston, and I'm the director of the Mebane Early Literacy Center here at UNC Charlotte. I was a special education teacher in kindergarten, for kindergarten through 5th grade students. I taught all the subjects, but I really enjoyed and loved teaching literacy. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Mary, to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Mary Durfel, Assistant Director of Early Literacy in the Office of Early Learning, and similar to Angela, I taught for a long time, but I was a general classroom teacher, so 16 years in the classroom, and then a few years as a coach before I came to work at the DPI. And so we have a great partnership going with Mebane Early Literacy Center and are so grateful for the learning that we're able to do together. So thanks for coming today, guys.
Okay, great. So let's start with some myth busting. Here we go. Truth or myth? Read alouds in K2 are just for enjoyment. If kids are talking, comprehension is happening. Young children aren't ready for complex text. Tell me, guys, in the chat, what do you think that is? Truth or myth? Oh, look at all these myths. You guys are so smart. You don't even need me to ask. Correct. It's a myth. Those are myths. We know. And this comes right from Dr. Christ's webinar. So if you were with us just a couple weeks ago, you would have seen her ask these exact same questions. Why are they myths? Because we actually know that read alouds in K2 are such a powerful way for us to help our students build their comprehension, vocabulary, and also their background knowledge, which is key to general comprehension and understanding and making meaning. We also know that there are certain kinds of talk that are more effective than others. So it's really important that we think about how are we using talk and conversation and questioning when we're talking with our students so that they can really be making meaning. And complex text is needed. We need our students to have experience with text that is beyond what they can physically read, that they're hearing their teachers model and having those discussions so that they can really start to strengthen and build their vocabulary, their comprehension, and again, their background knowledge. All right, so before we get into today's content, there's a term that I want to make sure all of you are familiar with. So on a scale of 1 to 5 in the chat, 1 being not familiar at all, 5 being I could turn on my video and teach this to you guys. How familiar are you with the concept of dialogic talk? Yeah, okay. I am not surprised. So dialogic talk, then dialogic reading, that's really comes from the early childhood research. So there's a lot of work on dialogic talk and reading with the pre-K kids and getting them thinking and talking. So we're going to talk some about how this also transfers into the K2 space. So dialogic classroom talk, if we go to the research, what does research say and how does it define it? It really is an approach for teachers to use to foster high quality interactions. So teachers and students engage in dialogue, meaningful dialogue, so that they can talk about a book, or it can also be like an experience or something that they're doing. But it's a way for our students to actually share their ideas, for them to hear you talking about something and build and strengthen those communication and understanding around this idea. Okay, that's a lot of words to say. In other words, dialogic talk is talking with students instead of talking to students, all for the purpose of making meaning. So it's being really strategic as a teacher around what is it that you're asking the students? How are you guiding your students to get to an answer? If we were in a room right now, I'd be like, I would say, hey, how many of you have ever asked questions of your students to get them to be thinking in the direction you're trying to get them to without just telling them the answer? Or guiding them through their own thinking process where you're asking them, well, how did you get to that? Why did you think that? What's your rationale? And getting the students to think about what they know and how they know it. So dialogic talk, this concept, this ability to support our students and talking with them, not just talking to them, that's really where we're going to focus on today. So we're going to start with these 4 effective K2 read aloud practices that Dr. Christ shared in her webinar. And the first is high leverage dialogic talk. The second is research-based talk turns, then creating space for meaning makers, and finally text selection. So we're going to start with high leverage dialogic talk. And we're going to give time for Dr. Christ to share her perspective. And this way you are hearing the same thing that your school administrators heard in this webinar. I'm going to show that every time there's a video, you'll notice this notes document here. So as you're watching these videos, if you're having any of those ideas jump up to you, you can capture your thoughts in this note taker. And then Dr. Fitzgerald is going to toss it in the chat so that everybody has access to it. It is a copy, forced copy only. So you're going to have your own version. So if you lose it, you'll end up having multiple copies. So try to keep track of it yourself. All right, let's watch and listen as Dr. Christ explains what she means about high leverage dialogic talk.
Next, and this will be the bulk of my presentation, we're going to go through 4 things to look for during read alouds. The first thing is high leverage dialogic talk. So take a look at this transcript, and this actually comes out of one of the research papers that will be in your resource folder for you after the presentation. Ms. Davis asks, what do you think the word preserve means? Addison says, save the flowers. Ms. Davis repeats, something to save the flower. Very good, Addison, I agree with you. So what is she trying to do here? Save the flower from what? Sean says, she has to save the flower. She doesn't want it to get cut. Ms. Davis says, she doesn't want it to get cut, so she's going to preserve or save it. Very good. As Sean says, save. Ms. Davis says, how do we know she's trying to save the flower? What evidence can you find on this page? And Oberon says, because she's building something. And the something they're building is a fence around the flower. So co-construction of meaning across several teacher and child talk moves like this, including using key vocabulary and eliciting the students' reasoning and textual evidence behind their inferences, is really important for developing, co-constructing deep comprehension during the read aloud. This is an example of moderate level talk. So Ms. Abel asks, what other creatures do you think will come to the preserve now that they have a safe place to live? Hakeem suggests a snake. And Ms. Abel says, a snake, very good. And Carter says, snake bites you. And Jaden suggests a frog. In this example, the teacher asks a good inferential question and allows several children to respond, but she does not elicit their reasoning or their interactive dialogue. That's why this is moderate level.
Okay, so in the chat for just a minute, I want you to tell me what did you notice the difference between those two examples? And we have a lot of people in here, so the chat's gonna go fast. I'll try to grab a couple as I see them go by. But we saw Dr. Chris talk through a script or a dialogue of a teacher and a couple of her students that was high leverage. And then she shared the moderate leverage. What was the difference between them? All right, more academic language, deeper discussion, explicit questioning and asking students. Yes, great, Kelly. So notice how she asked the students to tell me more about that and go back into and really elicit more responses from the students versus in the others, we're hearing the student and then we go to the next student. We go to the next student, and that happens often, but when we can get the same students to share and go deeper into it and answer why is it that they said that or tell me more about that, that's what we're looking for in this high leverage dialogic talk. Yes, a richer conversation. I love that, Nicola. Yes, a richer conversation. Very good. So one of the things that we have created for all of you is a brief. And the brief itself goes through the research that Dr. Christ shared with us that she used in her webinar. And Shannon, who was at the very beginning in the intro slide, she developed this wonderful brief around K2 and read alouds. So if we could get that one in the chat, Miranda, I'm not sure if I have that in the right spot. This table that we're about to talk through is actually from that brief, and that will give you even more research behind and more content just to kind of come back to beyond just being at our webinar today. So when we think about high leverage dialogic talk, we want to really focus on the fact that we are trying to help students co-construct deep comprehension and understanding of the text. It happens with the teacher and student interactions. So it's all about getting students to more deeply understand what it is that they're reading and think about their own thoughts about it and their own knowledge behind it to be able to get that. So the research shows us these things, and then you can also see the column of what does it actually look like in practice. So it sounds complicated, but when you actually look at the things you're going to do as a teacher, it's pretty straightforward, and some of you might already do this anyways. So things like asking detailed questions allows students to elaborate and provide reasoning and evidence. Allowing your students the opportunity to discuss the actual vocabulary words that you've been learning and talking about, that helps them to then retain those vocabulary words. And also incorporating some gestures or movements to help support your students' understanding of those vocabulary words. Inviting a student or students to respond as much as possible so that they themselves can begin constructing their own meaning and understanding of what they're reading. And students can make greater connections when they have multiple opportunities to read the same text and go deeper each time. And then students work together to construct the meaning with the teacher as the facilitator versus just being the primary disseminator of the knowledge. So when we're working with our students to really dig into that knowledge and meaning, we want to use dialogue, use our conversations, use our conversations to help support them to make that meaning. All right, so in high leverage dialogic talk, there's a few things that we want to avoid. So these are some things we're going to move away from, which would really focus on just asking those simple yes, no recall questions. So sometimes that's the first one that comes up, but we want to then go deeper into that and help our students move beyond that. We want to avoid moving on after one student has responded. That's more like that second example that Dr. Chris talked about. Instead of evaluating answers as a right or wrong right away, we could think about how can we support our students to dig deeper and help guide them and scaffold them to deepen their understanding and meaning of the questions that we're asking. We want to limit just teacher and student only, or one teacher to one student, or just the teacher only talking. And then there are actually times for interjections. So students who have experience or culturally relevant experience themselves to the text, when they are sharing, other students can learn about their own cultures and make connections in that way as well. And then we want to avoid treating discussion as a quiz and instead think of it more as how are we collaborating and sharing our thinking in this work. So we're going to watch this video. And before we watch, I want you, remember you've got that guided notes document. Notice how your teacher engages with her students across multiple talk moves. How does she respond to them, encourages them to use the vocabulary, and build on one another's thoughts. And then we'll talk about that.
Niece Gets Carried Away, and it's written by Hannah E. Harrison. And it's about this cat, and her name is Bernice. And you can see that she's really what? Yeah, she's grumpy. I can tell because her hands are like this and her face is all scrunched up. She's in a bad mood. Can you show me what you look like when you're in a bad mood? Oh, look at those grumpy faces. Before we get to reading, I'm going to teach you a new word. A word that we can use when we're in a bad mood. The word is brooding. What's the word? Brooding. And brooding means when you have unhappy thoughts. So the word is brooding. I'm going to put it up here. Is a cloud. It's a cloud, right? The cloud is brooding. And I'm going to actually show you that in our book. So here's Bernice, and she is brooding. She's in a bad mood. And if you look in the corner, I wonder if my friends in the back can see that. Cloud. Yeah, what's the cloud doing? Yeah, the cloud. That's a picture. I'm thinking about Bernice here, and I can tell she's in a bad mood, but it looks like she's where? At a party, right? So I'm wondering why she is unhappy at a birthday party. I'm also thinking about what I know about books. And I can see that in the beginning of the book, Bernice is in a bad mood. She's brooding. But how do you think she's going to feel by the end of the book? Happy, happy, happy. I hear a lot of people saying happy. Can you tell me why you think? Yeah, why do you think she might be happy at the end? You think that something good is going to happen? I can see that other people have their hands up. If you agree. So what did you notice about how she was supporting her students? She did an excellent job of providing a think aloud as a teacher. This is a really strong example of modeling for students how we're thinking about the vocabulary, how we're looking and talking about the book and what we know.
She talked about how the girl was in a bad mood, but she's at a party. And so she was saying, I'm wondering why, and getting the students to be thinking about that. And the students were comfortable enough to share and talk about how they felt happy or talk about being happy as they were there as well. So as you're thinking about your read alouds, providing your students the chance to talk and take turns and is going to really help support their meaning. All right. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mary, and she is going to talk about talk turns.
Okay, so now let's dig a little deeper into the next effective read aloud practice, research-based talk turns. So Dr. Christ is going to explain the research-based talk turns, and she's going to give you a framework for using them before, during, and after a read aloud. So this is just a short video, but let's take a look. Oh, Angela, I think you have to unmute so we can hear.
The support for deeper comprehension development. Some of the research-based talk turn types are building background knowledge, monitoring comprehension, supporting making inferences, teaching key vocabulary, and facilitating retelling or summarizing. Now, during read alouds, we often do embedded definitions during reading and more extended vocabulary instruction after reading. And so we're going to
All right. So you saw she named the 6 research-based talk turns, and you can go to the next slide. We want to plan in our read alouds to use these research-based talk turns. And in our next video clip, you're going to see Dr. Chris talk about this framework. So we can use those talk turns before reading, during reading, and after reading. So, but building background knowledge can be done in multiple ways before reading using text sets that build knowledge over time, or even multimedia to activate or build knowledge around new topics. And then let's think about during reading. During reading, the talk turns that you can do are monitor comprehension, support making inferences, and teach key vocabulary. So, monitoring comprehension, when you're reading, using text structure to guide students' thinking along the way. That can help them ensure that their comprehension is on track. If you attended Dr. Kelly Cartwright's first SCORE webinar or her SCORE Plus Teach webinar, she did a beautiful job talking about how the text structure is a frame that we can hang the rest of the text on. So it gives us a framework for creating a mental model. Questioning should be used to help students attend to important parts of the text, those critical pieces that they must understand in order to create that mental model. And teachers should prioritize giving corrective feedback when a student loses the thread of the story. Supporting making inferences. We want to do that while we're reading. You can explicitly prompt students to elicit text clues, so that textual evidence, as well as background knowledge, so the text plus what we already know, to support them in making those inferences. Questioning should go from broad, what do you notice on this page that might be important, to narrow, why is it important to note that the character is crying here? Teaching key vocabulary during the read. So let's talk about this embedded vocabulary. Dr. Christ made a really great distinction in her webinar where she talked about that when you are doing a read aloud, you want to teach key vocabulary embedded during the reading and then extend it after the reading. However, if you are using or are working with older students and you're expecting them to read the text, that's when it's beneficial to do that pre-teaching of the vocabulary, and you certainly can come back to it during and after. But she made that nice distinction, which some of you may be wondering about if you're thinking about your LETRS Volume 2 work with the explicit teaching of a new vocabulary word. So this is not different. It's just thinking about where it fits when you do this in a read aloud. So the first consideration when teaching embedded vocabulary is selection. Key vocabulary will be both important to overall meaning of the story, and usable for students across contexts. So embedded definitions should be student friendly, and they should ensure that students maintain their comprehension, prompt for word noticing, and brief enough not to disrupt the read aloud. Now, after reading, those talk turns that you want to do are around facilitating retell and summarization and extending vocabulary instruction. So let's look at facilitating retelling and summarizing. Visual supports like story grammar, graphic organizers, and also bilingual retelling. Those are all strategies that facilitate retelling. And an easy way to do this is to reuse a text structure anchor chart constructed during reading and use pictures or other prompts from the story to support students. Additionally, for any multilingual learners, encouraging them to retell first in their native language ultimately improves retelling in that second language. And then let's think about extending vocabulary instruction after reading. You can extend vocabulary instruction by revisiting some of those key words, by reviewing the definition and checking for understanding using questioning. So elicit the student-friendly definition of the word, get students to identify examples and non-examples of the word, and then ultimately all of that work is going to improve vocabulary word learning and retention. So when you think about the LETRS vocabulary routine, it fits really nicely here in this extend vocabulary part of your read aloud. All right, let's do a little engagement activity. So where does each talk turn type fit into this before, during, and after reading framework? All right, so I'm going to name one of the talk turn types, and you are going to drop in the chat if it is before reading, does it fit during reading, or does it fit after reading? All right, so listen carefully. The first one is, where does supporting inferences fit in the framework? Before, during, or after? Yes, before. Hooray! Awesome. You guys are brilliant. I knew you would be. All right, what about extending vocabulary? Before, during, or after? Extending. After. Yeah, that's right. There you go. After. You're going to extend that vocabulary after the read. What about facilitating a retell or a summary?
The hard one.
Yes, after, right? We're going to do that before. Just kidding. Good job, guys. All right, what about monitoring comprehension? When are you going to do that one? During, yes, absolutely. Okay, and what about teaching key vocabulary? Embedded, yes, that's going to be during. Yep, those embedded definitions are going to happen during reading, and then you're going to extend it after reading. If you're having the students do the reading, you can do that vocabulary work before reading as well. That will help students construct the meaning. All right, great job, guys. So now let's go on to Dr. Christ explaining the talk turn types to you here. This is just a short video where she'll explain the framework
of those talk turn types. We've organized these research-based kinds of talk turns into a framework for read aloud talk type integration. Before reading, we want to activate background knowledge. During reading, we want to help teachers to monitor, infer, and teach key vocabulary, particularly providing embedded definitions that are quick and don't disrupt the story. And then after reading, we want to facilitate children retelling or summarizing the story, and then engage in extended vocabulary instruction to try and deepen their new vocabulary learning.
All right, so there we saw just a brief description of the framework from Dr. Christ. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So here, guys, we're going to, in your guided notes, you have a viewing guide. Okay, I want you to go ahead and open up that viewing guide. It should be a forced copy because this is a longer video. We didn't want to break it up to disrupt the flow. So Dr. Christ is actually going to do a model here and take you through an example of a read aloud and show each of the research-based talk turns using the framework that she introduced. So I want you to use the 2-column chart on the viewing guide to help keep you focused and take notes about the examples that Dr. Christ shares for each of the components in the framework. All right, let's go ahead and view this together.
I'm going to share examples of how to address each of those components from the framework using this book drawn together by Midley. This book is about a boy and his grandfather, and they have some difficulty communicating because they speak different languages. But through the story, they are able to connect through drawing and able to communicate and through their drawing together. So the first component that I'm going to talk about is building background knowledge. One way to help children build background knowledge is to use what Goldie Mohammed calls layered texts, or some people refer to as text sets. This is when you're reading multiple texts across multiple texts on a similar topic. Doing so helps children build background knowledge, and it also helps them build vocabulary as well. So when we're looking at a book like Drawn Together, we might want to read and discuss other themes such as immigration, multilingual families, cultural differences, ties within families, all of these in the interest of supporting building background knowledge across texts. Additionally, we can use digital and multimedia to support building background knowledge, such as this video of students' stories about their experience of immigration. So in this video clip, several children talk about what it's like to immigrate to the United States, what the experience was like for their families. They talk about language and building language in English in the United States and what that's like for themselves and also for their parents. And this helps children build relevant background knowledge to better understand the story as well. The second planning component is monitoring comprehension. We're helping children pay attention to and track meaning while they're listening to the story. This will eventually lead to better monitoring of comprehension when children read independently. I'll share 2 ways to support monitoring that are strongly backed by research. So research supports using both text structure and questioning to support monitoring during read-alouds. Note that text structure of this book is story elements, but you'd use whatever text structure of your read-aloud might be. So the questions here work well for all texts within narrative structure, like Drawn Together. You can use story elements as an anchor chart, reminding children of each element's meaning and modeling, identifying the first element that you encounter. For example, characters and setting based on this page of Drawn Together. I like to invite children to raise a hand when they hear an element that should be added to the chart during reading to promote more independent monitoring. But if no one notices, I can always prompt them, have we heard anything yet that we can add to our chart? Likewise, you can use questioning to draw attention to and elicit these narrative elements. This can help check and repair children's comprehension, but it does not have the added benefit of being a strategy that children can use independently. I like to prepare my read aloud questions using sticky notes and put them on the relevant pages of the book. It's critical when helping children monitor to not only check their understanding, but also to help them correct their misunderstandings. Misunderstandings should never be overlooked. The third read aloud planning component is supporting making inferences. Both building background knowledge and monitoring support children's inference generation processes. To make an inference, we use 2 sets of clues, text clues and background knowledge. What we deduce or read between the lines using these clue sets is our inference. This is a sample inferential question from the text, which we'd ask on this page. The sticky notes help for tracking these questions within the book. We can ask what kinds of text clues children notice and give feedback about whether those clues might help us make the inference. Likewise, we can ask what children know about the world that might help them make this inference. We elicit the 2 sets of clues. Then we ask children to use these 2 sets of clues to make their inference. Sometimes we need to ask more specific questions, like, what do you notice about the words they're speaking? Or have you ever had a difficult time understanding someone because they're speaking another language? You can also connect back to their knowledge building, such as a related book or video that you shared. We always want to start with broader questions and move toward narrower questions as needed to support children's responses. The fourth read aloud planning component is teaching key vocabulary. Teaching key vocabulary will also support monitoring, inferencing, and retelling. We'll start with teaching key vocabulary during reading. Later, we'll talk about revisiting and deepening it after we read. So first we need to think about selecting key vocabulary. The words that we select to teach should be important to understanding the story, and they should also be words that are usable by children. An example of a word that's important to the book and usable by children is speechless. My child-friendly definition of speechless is not being able to say anything because of the big feelings you have. I'd read the page and then provide my embedded definition. Embedded definitions ensure children can maintain comprehension. They also prompt for word noticing and are brief enough not to disrupt the flow of the story. The fifth read aloud planning component is facilitating, retelling, or summarizing. All the previous practices pour into and support facilitating, retelling, or summarizing. Three practices that have strong research support are using visual supports, using story grammar, and encouraging bilingual retelling for bilingual students. Using visual support and story grammar can be interconnected and refer back to your monitor and anchor chart. You can model how to begin a retelling. In the story drawn together, the boy and his grandfather spent a lot of time at home together, modeling retelling and characters and setting. Then elicit other information using questions. What comes next? Or more specifically as needed, what were the important events, the things that happened in the story? Eventually, with guidance and practice, children will be able to use a text structure graphic organizer to guide their independent retelling of the story. For bilingual students, retelling is significantly improved by first retelling in their first language and then retelling in their other language. Being explicit about providing such opportunities can support your bilingual students' retelling success. Finally, after reading is also a time to deepen key vocabulary. Engaging in this after reading step significantly improves vocabulary, word learning, and retention. Extended vocabulary instruction includes reviewing the word's definition and checking children's understanding. For example, for speechless, I'd ask, does anybody remember the word speechless from the story? If so, what does it mean? Then I confirm or correct the definition. It means not being able to say anything because of the big feelings you have. Further, I'd ask questions such as, would you be speechless if someone asked you if you wanted ice cream? I might give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And would you be speechless if you were really surprised? Again, maybe a thumbs up or a thumbs down. These questions help check and then give us an opportunity to correct children's word meaning understandings.
Okay, I hope that you enjoyed those examples. I love that video because she does such a nice job of showing a model of what each of those talk turns could look like and sound like. So now that you've viewed that, what component of the framework stood out to you as being particularly effective? What stood out to you from that video as being particularly effective? Drop it in the chat and I'll try to follow along here.
While our friends are thinking and writing in the chat, I think one of the parts that I appreciated was how she talked about the same concept that Dr. Cartwright talked about when we're making inferences. Like what's the background knowledge, what's plus what's in the text to help us come together and think about those different components. And this idea of putting the thinking on the table. So we're helping support our students by guiding them through those thinking processes.
Oh, I love it. Thank you, Angela, for bringing that up. I'm seeing
Here
lots
we
of
go.
great ideas.
Mhm.
Yeah, the extended vocabulary. She discusses extending vocabulary after reading, Great case for the deep dives in wit and wisdom being used after the lesson. Very good. Awesome. Happy to hear that bilingual students retelling, yes, in their native language. I saw several people write that in. Love the vocabulary extension, background vocabulary. Yeah, there's so many good components there. A lot of it you're probably doing, but this can give you ideas of how to do it even more effectively than you're already doing it. Excellent, excellent. All right, loved the organizer. Same. Okay, so let's look at this third effective practice for read alouds, creating space for meaning makers, ways to share power and resulting literacy opportunities. So, by creating space for meaning makers, we can create additional literacy opportunities for all students in our class. Students can and should learn from one another. Some examples are included in the table on this slide, and you will find this table in your research brief as well. Let's just look at the ways to share power. Providing space for initiating new, unplanned topics during the discussion, being responsive to the topics that students initiate rather than shutting those down, creating space for that while still keeping students on track. Create space for students to provide cognitive or linguistic supports, which helps their peers develop better understanding. Sometimes the kids can say it way better than the teacher can. You know, you've been in those moments. I know I certainly have. Confirm, praise, or revoice the supports provided by students. Some of that expansion language that we can do to support oral language for students. Ask your students to use and share their multilingual knowledge to help others learn new vocabulary. It's a strength that our students bring with them when they're multilingual. And so we want to honor that. We want to lift it up. We want to give them opportunities to be part of the conversation about the books that we are reading. And create space for spontaneous, non-solicited responses to the book, such as unanticipated inferences. So one of my very favorite quotes, and it's not on here, but I just have to share it with you. It's by Lewis Carroll, and he says, "What good are books without pictures and conversations?" And I just love that because reading is social. And what I love about this creating space for meaning makers is we want to make sure that in this social event of reading aloud in our classroom, that we bring in all of our students and we create a space for all of our students to have a voice. So we've all kind of experienced unplanned topics. You might be thinking that in your head, like, I've got to get through this lesson. We can't do this lesson for 45 minutes. I've only got 25, right? And I've been there too. We've experienced students blurting out spontaneous inferences. But remember, all students have knowledge to share, and they can be meaning makers when given the opportunity. So it's up to us as teachers to think about streamlining those opportunities. This requires us, though, to share our authority with the students in our classroom and reframe those moments as opportunities for everyone to learn. So let's look at the next slide to see a few more ideas around creating space for meaning makers. Meaning makers often have specific cultural or linguistic knowledge, which can benefit all the students in the class. So when texts are culturally relevant to them, they may share their funds of knowledge with the teacher, the other students, in a way that enriches us all. So think about the students in your room and the experiences, the cultures, and the languages that they bring as assets to your discussions in Read Aloud. All right, now we're going to watch Dr. Christ talk about creating space for meaning makers. This is a shorter video. It's only around 3 minutes, but feel free to take notes on your guided notes document as we watch.
All right. The third thing we're going to look for during read alouds is teachers creating space for meaning makers. When teachers create space for meaning makers during read alouds, this creates additional literacy opportunities. You can read more about this in our 2021 Reading Teacher article that will be under the resources folder, but I'm going to provide 3 examples of how teachers can do this across the next few slides. First, teachers can create space for students to initiate new unplanned topics. For example, in the middle of a read aloud, Sarah says, "Oh, we can't put this on the floor." She's talking about the read aloud book. Ms. O says, "Oh, you don't have to put it on the floor. You can be careful with it, thank you." And then Sarah explains, "Because this," and she's pointing to the illustration of the Quran in the read aloud, "is special." This is new invited information that Sarah initiated, and Ms. O invited her initiation. Second, teachers can ask students to share their cultural knowledge. So in this transcript excerpt, Ms. O is engaged in a read aloud with two children who are from Nepalese background. And the text is focused on Nepalese culture. And so Ms. O asks the kids, "What is that?" Meaning the churia in the story. And the children tell her, "It's a kind of churia. It's small, it's like rice, but not a rice. And we put milk in it and eat it." So essentially, the children are able to share their cultural knowledge to extend understanding of the story. They're positioned as knowers and meaning makers. Third, teachers can create space for spontaneous, non-solicited responses. So for example, Ms. O is reading a book about refugees when they're leaving the country, and she reads the excerpt. "I wanted to take Musa, my cat, but my mother said we must save ourselves and not the animals. I cried then, not for my uncle, but for Musa." And spontaneously, one of the children says, "Musa died then." And another child says, "His uncle died too." And so they're spontaneously making inferences in the story because the teacher is inviting them to spontaneously respond when they're noticing things in the book.
Okay, so there you saw a few examples of ways to create space for meaning makers. Let's go ahead and look at the fourth effective practice in read alouds, and that is text selection. So, culturally relevant text encourage students to talk more. It facilitates more inference making and use of target vocabulary. Additionally, they have an added benefit for our emergent multilingual students. Students also need opportunities to read expository text because they contain more rare words to increase vocabulary and offer opportunities for literal and higher order talk with more opportunities for discussion with feedback. The richer the text, the richer the conversation can be around it. And then thematic text sets build all students' background knowledge and vocabulary over time. These can be based around content, genre, which we're getting ready to look at that in a few minutes, or large concepts. All right, so we've looked at the 4 effective read aloud practices. Now let's look at a clip from a lesson. It's a kindergarten read aloud and text-based discussion. All right, so what might this look like in a kindergarten classroom? Let's watch this teacher. She's going to facilitate a text-based discussion with her kindergartners on the book Me, Jane, which is a text about the famous scientist Jane Goodall. As you watch this short clip, I want you to look for 2 things. Where does the teacher use something to scaffold student talk? And where do students make an inference and support it with evidence from the text? All right, so look for those 2 ththings while you watch.
Anya, what's an example from the book that shows us that Jane's dream was to work with animals? Her drawings in her journal. Who agrees with Stefania? You can use the sentence stem. I agree with you because. Ashlyn, can you use that sentence stem? Say, I agree with you because.
It looks like she cut out stuff and she drew stuff.
Why did she draw all these different pictures?
Because she loves studying animals.
She loves studying animals. Who can give us another example from the book? Caroline?
When she wanted to see and after she saw the egg hatch, there was a bunch of baby chicks.
So what is that picture where she saw the eggs hatch? What does that tell us, Caroline, about Jane?
That she wanted to study.
She wanted to study animals, such as chickens. My hope is that they can all work together to have a discussion surrounding the big picture. What was Jane's dream? How do you know? What page could you find that on? And if they can do this during whole group read alouds, my hope is that when they're reading with each other, whether it be partner reading in the library or during guided reading groups with me, they start to become more willing and able to lead these discussions about texts on their own.
Learn more at literacyessentials.org.
Okay, so if you'll go back real quick.
Sorry.
So just drop in the chat what did the teacher use to scaffold student talk? Drop that in the chat. That was at the beginning. Yeah, the sentence stem. Excellent. Yes, yes, yes. And yes, very good. You guys were paying attention. I love it. Where students made an inference and supported it with evidence from the text, that was where there were, I believe, 3 students that gave examples from the text that showed us that Jane loved studying animals. They gave the example of she was cutting out the pictures of the animals, which tells me she loves studying animals. And then the example with the baby chicks, where Jane watched the baby chicks being hatched. And drew pictures of it. So you can see there that even in kindergarten, this teacher is asking her students and laying a strong foundation here, using those sentence stems for discussion that moves across not just teacher to student conversation, but also from student to student. So she's using questions too that require the students to make inferences and identify evidence from that text, right? So she has crafted inferential questions. All right.
And if you noticed on that poster behind her, when the camera panned, there were other sentence stems too. So I agree with because, I disagree because, and so it was nice to see that she was supporting them to think in multiple ways around the story and the conversations, and gave them a variety of sentence stems to use.
Yeah, and you know what? If you guys want to see this entire video, it's not super long. It's only 8 minutes. And you watched the end. At the beginning, you can actually see her do a review of how she uses those sentence stems with her class. If you're wanting to do something like that, I would encourage you to watch this video because it's a great example of how you can start thinking about getting that going in your own classroom. Okay, so we've looked at some examples, we've looked at some samples. Now we're going to talk about when you sit down to plan your read alouds. All right, so we're going to make some curriculum connections. I know that not every district in the state has a language comprehension curriculum or a curriculum that kind of gives you materials for read aloud during K2, but many of our districts do. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this through the lens of how do I do the excuse me, how do I do this with my curriculum materials? And if you're here and your district doesn't provide those materials, I want you to think about, as I'm going through, what the curriculum materials include and what I want to think about layering in. Use this opportunity to think about, oh, how is this organized so that you can use those same ideas for organizing your own lessons, okay? So without further ado, let's look at a lesson. So we want to be really intentional in planning to include these 4 effective read aloud practices. And so when you're planning with your curriculum, a huge part of that is lesson study and familiarizing yourself with the text. So when you do that, you're going to put on this lens of where will well, really, the way I would think about it is where were my research-based talk turns fit? And how can I include questions that are going to lend themselves to high leverage dialogic talk opportunities? And then I want to think explicitly about where can I create space for meaning makers? How can I be intentional about that? And then I want to ensure that my text selection is in alignment with those four, with the effective practice of choosing text. All right, so quick reminder before we dive in to planning with our curriculum. You can go to the next slide, Angela. If you joined us, did it freeze? Let's see.
All right, we are having a time with the technology. I just got notified that my internet on campus is unstable, so I apologize. Okay, let's keep going.
Let's keep going if we can. If not, I can try to share my screen, Angela.
Can you still see? Is it still shared?
I can see, but it's not the right slide.
Okay. Are we
Oh,
on
there
this
we
one
go.
now? Okay.
Perfect. All right, so just a quick review here about when we think about read alouds and when we do this with students. Sorry, I had to get my brain back here. I had to bring back my brain. We're thinking all of that, all of those things, all of that, those four practices are all in service of supporting students to create a mental model or a situation model. And you may remember if you attended Dr. Kelly Cartwright's webinar, she used this great example, this visual of Legos to illustrate building a mental model. So when we begin to read, the process of comprehension involves building a structure in our heads as we read. So you could think about it as we have these building blocks in our head that come from the text itself and also what we know about the topic in our own mind. And what we have to do as we read is we have to build a cohesive model so that we can understand the message or the information or the idea that the author is trying to convey to us. So we have to use the situation model or the mental model is we take the text meaning, which is made of building blocks that come from the text and our minds. Those are those Legos. And then we put them together to create a big picture, a model, a cohesive model or example of the idea that the author is trying to convey. And so I want you to remember that everything you're doing when you're planning is in service of supporting students to create a mental model that is cohesive, that makes sense, just like those Legos that are put all together at the end, right? We want to help them put those Lego blocks together so that it forms a structure that makes sense, a cohesive mental concept or mental situation model of the ideas in the text. Our goal is cohesion. All right, so let's go to the next slide here. So thinking about curriculum, when you approach your curriculum materials and you're thinking about planning to do this with the materials that you have in your district. So to make connections to how this is going to play out, we're now going to look at a lesson example from an open source curriculum and identify where the four effective practices already exist in the lesson, and then consider where we may need to strengthen the lesson to include those practices. Now, I'm not going to model it here because you've already seen examples. I'm just talking about where I can identify it as I'm planning, and then I can also intentionally go ahead and plan to layer in those four effective practices. So this is a second grade CKLA lesson. It's linked here on the slides. It's open source. Anyone can look at it. And students are going to start a fairy tale unit. This is the first lesson in that fairy tale unit. They're going to read The Fisherman and His Wife, which explores themes of greed and contentment. So a poor fisherman releases a magical fish who grants his wife's increasingly greedy wishes, from a cottage all the way to she wants to become a queen, until her final demand leaves them back in their little hovel where they started. So the idea that we want students to take away from this story, the big enduring understanding, is we want them to be able to determine the lesson of this story, which really highlights the dangers of greed and the importance of being content and appreciating what you have. We're also going to dig into some story fairy tale elements to support our understanding as we go. But thinking about that big enduring understanding, helping students build the mental model so that they can infer the lesson from this story, that we should be appreciative for the things that we have, and we should be weary of being greedy. We're going to do some specific moves. We're going to employ some very specific strategies using our talk turns, thinking about those 4 effective practices, dialogic talk, making space for meaning makers, and our text selection specifically. We're going to think about how are we going to help students along the way to build that cohesive mental model so they can get to that enduring understanding. Everything we do is in service of that. So let's just orient ourselves on the next slide here to the lesson at a glance. It gives you a nice overview from the curriculum materials to see the overall flow of the lesson and get an idea of what the lesson writers have already baked in, right? So here you can see they've already put that you're going to talk about background information and some essential terms. They've already put in here that you're going to have some comprehension questions for discussion and some word work with the word displeases after the read. You can also see here just from the lesson at a glance that you're going to do an activity where you have students rewrite the read aloud. That makes me think about those graphic organizers that will support that work, right? And then there's even a take-home material, a family letter. All right, so let's go ahead and go to the next slide. What we're going to do moving forward is we're going to think about it using this 2-column chart. So I'm going to look at the lesson and see what does this lesson already include? And then what do I need to layer in from those 4 effective practices, right? So let's go ahead and click high leverage dialogic talk. Is it in there? Do I need to layer it in? Talk turn types. Where can I layer those in, or is it already there? Space for meaning makers. Is that already built in, or do I need to be intentional? And text selection. Okay, how's the text selection here that they're providing me? I'm going to evaluate that for myself. Now, it's important to notice that your materials won't always have all of the pieces. You can add in what you need. That's part of all of the training and the webinars that we're so excited to do together, over these last several years, is that teachers are the best teachers when they are even smarter than the curriculum, right? You've got these great curriculum materials, but also you have an incredible amount of knowledge for how to employ those materials and use them to support students. And I want to be really clear, what we're talking about right now, this can be done with any curriculum materials. You can also think about it in terms of if you don't have curriculum materials and how you can embed these pieces in your read alouds. All right, so let's get started. We're going to start with examining the text selection. This is kind of an easy one when you have a curriculum, so we'll start there. Text is always the center of any comprehension lesson that we plan for students because the demands of the text are going to determine what instructional moves I need to make as the teacher to ensure students are able to construct that mental model of the text. So here you can see that these open source materials already include grade level complex text. It's designed to prepare students for the increasing demands of vocabulary and syntax that they're going to encounter as they progress through the grades. So I'm setting them up in kindergarten through 2nd grade for all of these language experiences that are going to be far more challenging for them when they get older and the content gets more difficult. I have to start in kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, building that language. Additionally, these texts in this particular curriculum, they're organized by topic. So each unit is essentially an anthology of texts that build knowledge about a topic. In this case, it's a genre study of fairy tales and tall tales. So as I think about the text itself that's being used, the fisherman and his wife, because I'm considering my text selection, it stands out to me that that's a pretty Eurocentric fairy tale, Grimm's fairy tales, right? The Brothers Grimm were in Germany. And so it's definitely worth reading, classic literature. We want to read it, definitely worth using, but I want to be sure that I'm also being intentional about being culturally relevant and choosing texts that are culturally relevant for my students, because that's going to increase the likelihood that all the students are going to participate in discussion. So I'm going to be sure that I go ahead and layer in opportunities for students to read fairy tales that represent the diverse cultures in my classroom. I might do a bit of pre-work and go to the library and check out fairy tales from other cultures, make those readily available for my students, even maybe allow them to check them out and take them home. I may even talk to some students who I know are from other cultures and ask them if they're familiar with any fairy tales that they might want to share when we do our fairy tale unit. Tap into that knowledge that they're bringing. I'm going to have to plan for that kind of ahead of time, though, right? I can't do it the day of. I have to be proactive in that planning. All right, let's go on to our next piece, which is my next practice is I want to look for opportunities to make space for meaning makers. First, I'm going to look at the lesson and see what space is already there. As I look at my lesson, what I notice is that there are opportunities to turn and talk. Actually, it's built in after reading, not as much during reading. So I may be cognizant of providing a couple of opportunities during the read to do some of that turning and talking. And it also includes a list of other fairy tales that I might be interested in reading. That list still isn't very diverse. So again, I'm probably going to go beyond that list and consider fairy tales that are popular within the culture represented in my class. And I think by doing that, that's going to set my students up to have space to make meaning. All right, so I'm going to invite students to respond after the questions to a partner, those turn and talk opportunities, but I'm going to make sure that I layer in encouraging the emergent and multilingual students in my class to respond to questions in their home language first so that they can do an even better job of using English when they're ready to do that. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at high leverage, our next two practices. I kind of grouped them together. Creating space. So sorry. I've grouped two together, high leverage dialogic talk and talk turns. So let's look at these two. I'm going to think about this through the eyes of that framework: before reading, during reading, and after reading. Let's dig in before reading first. I combine these two because really I want to integrate my dialogic talk opportunities into the talk turns, right? That's what makes sense. So I'm going to use the framework and I'm going to look through my lesson. I'm going to start with the before reading and look closely at how the materials builds background knowledge. So again, I've already talked about it. There's going to be a brief discussion about the Brothers Grimm and where they lived long ago. We're going to use a map. And so I immediately see like, hey, this is where I can provide some opportunities for students to talk about other fairy tales that they've read before this lesson, or to prepare to talk about a familiar fairy tale from their culture. So this is where I could build in that talk opportunity. Right, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Oh, here you see the framework, right? This is happening before reading. I'm tapping into that background knowledge. I'm building the background knowledge. I'm also trying to create space for meaning makers for my students in my classroom. I'm trying to be really intentional about that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So the next piece here, before reading, we're still before reading in the framework. The lesson already includes building background knowledge of text structures and story elements. The teacher is going to facilitate, and you can go ahead and click here, Angela. The teacher is going to facilitate a discussion using this graphic organizer with students about the common elements of fairy tales and create an anchor chart with those elements. So this supports comprehension by building background knowledge about the text structure. All right. Now, I want to think very, very carefully about the language variations in my classroom, and I might consider adding in some sentence stems to support students here in this conversation to encourage more of that student-student talk. And in addition, I'm going to be intentional to ask my students in this part if they can think of examples of any elements of fairy tales from fairy tales they've already read, or if they have some examples from fairy tales from other cultures that have those same elements. So we can have a conversation about that. Like, are the elements the same if the fairy tale is from a different culture? So we can have a brief conversation there, which can create nice space for meaning makers within my classroom. Let's go to during reading. So the next part of the framework is, how am I going to use those talk turns and dialogic talk during reading? How am I going to create space for meaning making during reading? I notice that the lesson example, I noticed that I'm going to take a minute and remind you that we always need to identify here what our outcome is. We've talked about that. So this is where it gets really important when I start looking at this during the read. So for this particular story, we want students to determine that there's a lesson we can learn from this story. And that lesson is that it is important to be appreciative of what we have, to be content, and to guard against greed. So keeping that at the front of my mind, I'm going to review the questions carefully to make sure they're going to guide students and support them to make the types of inferences that are needed about the fisherman, about his wife, and about that enchanted fish to arrive at that lesson. So as I look through, there are lots of great questions in here, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to provide one example. You'll notice in the screenshot there that you'll see one of the questions is, do you think the fisherman's wife will be content with a stone castle? I noticed that in order to get to the place where students understand that one of the major lessons in the story is to be content with what you have, I know this is a critical spot for students to build that mental model. So I want to provide them support and discussion here. So I'm going to layer in some additional questions. I've got the question, but I'm going to layer in the opportunity for students to share their thinking. I'm going to elicit responses by saying, well, what evidence from the story made you think that the fisherman's wife will be content or will not be content? So I'm going to try to elicit some responses and conversation that way. I may consider providing sentence frames. I think that she will be content because, or I do not think she's going to be content because, and giving students an opportunity to build on what one another says. I agree. I think the same thing because. And so I'm also going to plan a few extra minutes here so that I can give payers time to talk. All right, next. I'm going to speed it up here so Angela can do her part. So during the reading, another piece that I noticed is that there are key vocabulary words already chosen, such as hesitated and content. So upon review, I conclude that these words are good. They're integral to the story. I'm going to keep these words. I noticed there's child-friendly embedded definitions. I'm going to keep it just like that, but I'm going to layer in maybe a gesture to support some of those words. Like for hesitated, I might put both hands in front of me with kind of a questioning look on my face. And I might do that for some of the other words to help students really solidify that embedded definition. All right, let's go to the final slide here and look at what students are going to do after reading. So this lesson includes an opportunity already to dive deeper into the word displeased. So we're going to do some vocabulary extension after. It's already there. So I'm going to definitely keep that in there, but I'm going to consider layering in the word content with this because to understand the characters in the story, that the wife is really unhappy and never content, it will be a really nice contrast to talk about what displeased means and then compare it to content, right? Like that's a non-example. If you're displeased, you are not content. So I'm going to go ahead and bring both of those words in to expand that. And then I'm also going to think about maybe later on in my domain or my unit, creating a gradable antonym activity for practice with these words later on, content and displeased. And then after reading, they're going to revisit that story and use that graphic organizer to do a retell. So you're going to facilitate that discussion of that retell, but then they're going to use it to rewrite their own version. So don't forget to invite multilingual students to retell the story in their first language. When you get to that part. Also, I want to just say here, make judicious decisions about the use of consistent graphic organizers that represent text structures. You may decide that because you're doing this writing activity, you want to use a graphic organizer during the read to outline those story elements as you go. You may think that's too much and you may want to just save it for after. But think about, you can use what your materials give you, but also LETRS Volume 2 in the appendix, they have tons of graphic organizers that you can pull from. All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Angela to talk about leadership and coaching.
All right, thank you, Mary. That was a really great example of thinking about planning. And what we wanted to share with all of you is what was shared with your administrators and your coaches and maybe fellow leaders that were in the webinar series with Dr. Courtney and sharing Dr. Christ and sharing what she directly said. We wanted you to be able to hear what she said to your leaders around supporting you to implement these practices.
So it's time to move on to our final objective, to plan for leadership and coaching next steps. I want to offer these 4 ideas as possible leadership and coaching moves to support teachers' engagement in highly effective read-alouds. So first, you can support planning for highly effective read-alouds. You can provide planning templates and co-planning sessions with feedback from an instructional coach. Second, you can provide opportunities for teachers to rehearse research-based talk turns during read-alouds during professional development or professional learning community sessions. Third, you can have teachers record their read-alouds and then self-reflect using a read-aloud quality rubric. Also, you can use these videos to anchor coaching conversations about read-aloud quality with an instructional coach. And finally, you can ensure that its schedules and materials protect time for planned high-leverage read-alouds. For example, there may be a designated time in the literacy block and text sets available aligned with curriculum content.
Okay, so that's what Dr. Chris shared with your school administrators around how to support this. And we want to know from you all, what type of, what are you already doing? What do you already have in terms of, oh, it's not in there. Just kidding. Okay, in the chat, go ahead and toss in what you're already doing. Do you already have grade level planning time? Do you use that planning time? Are you able to collaborate on all aspects of the literacy block? Do you have a coach or an administrator? And so if you have one, if you have all, put all, if you have the first one, do a number 1, a number 2, a number 3, a number 4. We'll do it that way real quick. So I'm seeing lots of alls. Oh my goodness, that's amazing. That's wonderful to hear and wonderful to see. Okay, great. So that's the first step. The first step is to say, what are we already doing? What do we already have? And now to think about, okay, so what does that mean in terms of being able to support and make sure that we have the right materials to have these effective read alouds. So, we were thinking about how to support teachers. This idea of going to professional development and then expecting teachers to be able to do it the next day is kind of baloney, right? We know that you're just going to sit in something or watching a webinar. It's not going to automatically happen that you're able to then use these new practices. So I wanted to think about, well, what's a framework? What could we guide you all in your thinking through around how to take something you've learned about, whether it's in a webinar, a class you took, from LETRS, from something that you've read, and then actually implementing it as a teacher in practice to strengthen your students and to help them be able to understand and comprehend what they read. So this process here, we're going to walk through. It's kind of a way for you to think about where you are within the idea of learning something new and then implementing it in your classroom. So I'm going to try to do this quickly. So the first big step here would be the Science of Reading PD. So some of you have taken LETRS. Some of you are here doing these Score Plus Teach webinars. Maybe you've attended a different Science of Reading PD, but it's really where you're learning the content and the information that you're going to take back to your classrooms. The second piece here is your PLC. So the next is saying, okay, now I want to have some conversations with my grade level teams around what it is that we learned in our Science of Reading PD. So you might say, hey team, I went to this webinar. I want to share the video with you. And then you have some conversations within the PLC around what you're seeing. And in that time, you're also saying, hey, I want to pick a specific skill. We're going to just focus on high leverage dialogic talk. And that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with the dialogic talk and just getting that into our daily conversations. We're going to try to add, why do you think that, to the questions that we ask, and pick something specific to then be able to practice. If you don't have a coach and you have a best friend teacher buddy that you want to do this with, or you have a team that you're comfortable with, but it's the idea of bringing people together where you can decide, hey, we're going to work on this together, we're going to learn together and support each other. The next section is in this gradual release kind of blue cycle. So you've picked something with your colleagues and with your best teacher friends or with the coach, and now you're going to actually try it out. So you might watch a model of somebody else doing it. You might watch a video. Maybe you want to do an observation, but you decide what's the best way for you to really see how this could happen or what this looks like or experience it myself. And then your next step would be to practice. So I've observed it. I've been able to see how it would work. Now I'm going to practice using this, and I might do it in class. I might actually do it at home. I might do it with my dog. But whatever it is that you feel comfortable with to give you some practice before then actually talking about it with your coach or your trusted colleagues. So it's this idea that I'm going to take something that I'm learning in a larger Science of Reading. I'm going to then talk about it in a PLC, and then I'm going to have a chance to actually apply and think about how can I get this to work in my classroom where I'm feeling comfortable and ready to do it. So this broader framework is something for you to take back with your teams and think through, yeah, how could we do this? Or are there specific practices that we want to try and embed in what we're already doing? If you have the time and you have the materials and you have the coach, this just kind of gives you the pathway to go from those PD to the classroom. All right, and we wanted to give you a chance. So we only have 2 minutes. So I'm just going to show you these things and you're going to be able to take them back. And we are not going to keep you past 5, my friends. So you've got these 4 practices to plan for a read aloud. When we think about implementation and how we're going to take something new, there's a lot of different aspects of ourselves that go into what we're doing. So what are your beliefs and values? What skills and experiences do you have with this work? What's your knowledge? Do you feel really strong about this? Do you have a lot that you want to learn or some other questions you need to dive into? And then what are some next steps? So the next piece is going back to Mary's framework where we think what's already in the lesson and then how do we layer in these 4 effective practices. I loved the example that she had about the question that was already in the lesson plan around the fisherman's wife. And then she said, why do you think that? And she added that extra piece to get the child to go deeper. All right, so here are the tools. We are going to share this from webinar to implementation. That's just some implementation things for you to think through, but your next steps are here. So identify one upcoming read aloud lesson where you will intentionally apply at least 2 of those practices that we talked about today. And I want you to think through with whether you're using the LETRS comprehension planning checklist, your own lesson plan that is similar with that before, during, and after. Who will you support with? What materials do you need? And where will you go if you have some questions? All right, big takeaways. Are we ready? Use high leverage dialogic talk to co-construct meaning across text. That's a big idea. We're not doing it just to do it. We're doing it to help kids be able to co-construct meaning. Research-based talk turns can be used before, during, and after. We want to create space for meaning makers because all of our students have knowledge to share and we want to learn from each other. And we can use text sets, complex text, and culturally relevant texts to help deepen our students' knowledge. The goal of all of this in active read alouds is to support students to make meaning and build that mental model. Go back to those Legos, that idea. And when planning, I want to identify what lesson it already includes, what our lesson already includes, what to layer in. And we are going to practice all of these things and then revisit our LETRS comprehension planning checklist to see how we can layer it all together. All right, folks, it is 5 o'clock. We did it. Woohoo! Here we go. So if you would please take the survey so that you can get your CEUs. And the certificate is linked. I checked, it is there, so you shouldn't have any issue with that. Next, for our SCORE webinars, we have Comprehension for Multilingual Learners. That's for your school admin. That's going to be with Dr. Kendall Turner-Nash on Wednesday, April 29th. We will have our SCORE Plus Teach for Upper Elementary Comprehension for 3-5 educators. That's happening the day before on Tuesday, April 28th. We're going to pick the same time at 3:30 and see how that works. And all the registrations are in the chat. So is the feedback survey. We thank you so much for staying with us in the evening on this lovely Thursday and hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.